Hey art nerds, happy Halloween. This is the second of two 2020 witch pieces that I created for this Halloween. I hope you guys will enjoy coloring along with me. There were some hiccups in the recording process and some of my footage was lost, and it was fairly important footage. So I went ahead and I recorded kind of a stopgap measure. So we're going to be talking about two major things in today's tutorial. We're going to be talking about coloring in backgrounds quickly and creating glow effects. And unfortunately, those were the two pieces of footage that got eaten. So I did record stopgap tutorials to kind of fill that gap. So this is a colored line art tutorial, and I'm using the Tombow fudenosuke brush pens for this, and I'm using a selection of colors. They have about 15 colors available, and I'm using about 8 of those. So she's going to be a red-headed girl wearing purple and cream colored clothing, and she's reaching for a ginger cat. And the ginger cat is basically my cat Remy, who passed away last year. I really like drawing Remy whenever I get the chance. It's a wonderful way to kind of remember her. In our other witch illustration, we went for so cute, she's kind of creepy. And the cat she was holding was somewhat loosely inspired by my first cat, Midnight, except longer furred. So if you're interested in another marker coloring tutorial where I demonstrate lots of different alcohol marker techniques, I hope you guys will check that out. You'll find it in the cards as well as in the description, but it went live just yesterday. So when inking this piece, I'm inking on Strathmore 300 series Bristol. I'd printed out some blue lines and penciled it, both for my own benefit as well as for yours, so that you could actually see what I'm doing. And I'm inking this, and I'm going to allow the inks to cure, to bond to the paper overnight, and this helps prevent smearing. And that's before I even erase the graphite. So for this style of inking, I'm using local color, what I think the colors are going to be, and I'm inking with an ink that complements that. When I'm finished with this illustration, I'm going to go back and re-ink it in certain places just to adjust the contrast. So for her hair, we went with yellow. It's like a fluorescent yellow because we have glow mushrooms up by that part of her hair, as well as red. We used brown for her eyelashes and green and yellow for her eyes. And for her bodice, we used black because we're going to be markering that with a really dark purple. And one of the ways I kind of figured this out is I went ahead and I made a cheat sheet of what colors I wanted everything to be, so that when I was inking and selecting my markers, I already kind of knew what I was going for. So the mushrooms are meant to be kind of a glowy, glow-in-the-dark green color. So I used one of Tombow fudenosuke's new neon colors, their neon yellow, to ink it as a base. And then I went over it again with green. In my other witch marker tutorial, I kept it very simple. I might have used 2 colors for each object or each part of the illustration. In this illustration, I'm actually using a few more colors just to create more depth, because this is going to be an illustration that has a lot of glow effects, but also takes place in a really dark room. So we're going to capture a lot of contrast in this piece. And I'm going to show you guys some of my favorite techniques, as well as try out a few new ones. So I'm really excited for this. If you'd like to color along with me, you can buy the line art, either a black and white version or the color version that I'm working with here, in the description down below through Gumroad. But if you're one of my fantastic patrons, one of my art nerds on Patreon, you actually get both line arts free. So that could be a really good reason to join my Patreon. It's just $2 a month to get started, same cost as the cost of this line art, and you get loads of free line arts as well as early access to almost all of my videos. So if you like the work that I'm doing here on the channel and you want to help support it, you can join me on Patreon. So there's several glow sources, light sources in this image, and one of them is the bubbling brew coming from the pot. So much like with the mushrooms, I inked it first with the fluorescent yellow, and then I inked the shadows with a regular green. I'm also using a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen in just regular black for, you know, the shadows and for the black in this illustration. Now originally I wanted to do one of the two witch illustrations as a live stream, but these ended up taking several hours to complete and have been time-lapsed several times to get them down into a more viewable format, so it wouldn't have really worked very well as a live stream. However, I do regularly host live streams here on this channel, usually on Saturday nights, although I'm taking a little bit of a break right now so that I could focus on finishing up Lilliputian Living and work on these witch pieces here, as well as get some progress made on 7-inch Kara Volume 2 and the Kickstarter fulfillment. But I do generally host Saturday night live streams where I cover all sorts of different topics. So if there's something you'd like to learn how to do, or you just want to hang out and chat, you can find me here on Saturday nights. And you can check my community tab, not only for art, but updates on when the next live stream is going to be. So for the orange cat, I'm inking with yellow, a little bit of orange, and some red, as well as that fluorescent green yellow on the wings, because the wings are another one of the light sources. So we have her wings, the cat's eyes, the mushrooms, her eyes, the girl's eyes, and then the glowing pot are all sources of green glow. So for the stones, I'm inking them in gray, and it's not a particularly dark gray, it's kind of a medium or a lighter gray, and I'm going to go and ink them again in black just to delineate where the shadows are going to be in this piece. And I know just looking at the inks, it looks a little bit rudimentary, a little bit basic, but I promise you it's really going to come together, and we're going to do a lot of really cool techniques today, so I'm very excited about that. For this illustration, I'm using a variety of alcohol markers. I'm not really brand loyal. I like a lot of different brands of alcohol markers, and when I buy markers, I try to use what I buy. So you're gonna see a wide variety of markers in this video. You don't have to use the colors I'm using. They're just suggestions. You can use whatever you like, and you can put your own spin on this line art. But I'm sharing the colors that I'm using in case that helps you guys understand my thought process a little bit better. And I'm going to have a list of all the colors selected, all the colors used, and what they're used for down in the description below, as well as links to the materials used and links to other alcohol marker tutorials here on this channel. I've got a lot of really great ones that I highly recommend, so I hope you guys will check them out. So now that it's been inked, we are going to allow it to cure for 24 hours before erasing the graphite. Now this is my swatch sheet. These are the colors that I used in this illustration. And with the other witch tutorial, you guys can see I number them. That's in order of when they're going to be used. And I also scratch out colors that are just absolutely not right for what I had in mind. And I always make swatch sheets for my illustrations. It helps me kind of keep everything together. So one of the first techniques we're demonstrating today is a masking technique. I've demonstrated lots of masking techniques here on this channel. We've used masking fluid, we've used masking friskets. Today we're using washi tape. And I am applying the washi tape to my skin to remove some of the tackiness. And spoiler, way later when I'm removing it from her face, it did tear a little bit. It tore the paper a bit. So you want to be really careful how much you layer it, how you cut it, and how carefully you remove it. Thing was, I got a little too excited when I removed it and I ripped it a little too fast. If I'd been more careful, it wouldn't have been an issue. I also used a sheet of paper just to smooth down, press down all my washi tape so that it's actually adhering to the paper, and that's going to allow me to cut it. I'm using a Cricut X-Acto blade to cut it. You can use whatever brand you like, but I really recommend you work with a really sharp blade for this. And if you're having trouble seeing your line art through your washi tape, you may want to work with a light table. Now you want to use the lightest, most delicate hand you possibly can when cutting through. You just want to cut through the thin washi tape. You don't want to cut your paper. I'm a little bit heavy-handed, and even though I was trying to be very careful, I ended up cutting through just a little bit. It didn't really negatively affect the image a whole lot, but it's something I wish I hadn't done, and I wish I'd been more careful to begin with. I'm also removing the washi tape as I go because it allows me to see what I'm doing a little bit more clearly. And then it's also allowing me to see areas where either the tape got messed up and I need to recut, or where tape never really made it to begin with. Now, I didn't cut as carefully as I should have. There's some areas where I kind of goofed up, but I'll show you later on ways and methods that you can kind of correct for that. All in all though, this is an excellent masking method. I had fewer problems with this than I've normally had using the adhesive masking frisket film that I used to use a lot in other videos, and I didn't have any problem with the washi tape leaving tacky adhesion on the paper. So now that everything's been masked off, I'm going to use some Copic Wides to apply a whole lot of color very quickly. One of the first things I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to mask off my edges as well to create a border. So unfortunately, this is one of the parts of the tutorial that got eaten, so I'm going to re-demonstrate this for you guys. I have here two custom filled Copic Wides, one with Ranger Eggplant and the other with BV23, a light blue-violet color. Now these are running kind of dry, but at full saturation you're going to get a lot more color and a lot less streakiness. So I would recommend you go ahead and you refill yours if you are using them before we start. Now we're using the masking tape, as I'm about to demonstrate, to mask off areas of white, to reserve areas of white. And the reason we're using the Copic Wides is it allows us to fill a large area on the paper very quickly. So once we've applied the washi tape, we can go ahead and color on top of it, and it's going to reserve the paper underneath. And you can do several layers of Copic Wide, building up your color and building up your saturation. Now, as I mentioned, mine are going kind of dry since I really did just use them on the witch piece and that got eaten. So use your imaginations here. You can also use rubbing alcohol to blend and soften the transitions, but this is really just a base layer. It's like an underpainting on an illustration. It's okay if it's a little bit rough. So we remove our washi tape and voila, it has been masked. So as you can see, many layers of Copic Wide have been applied to kind of build up the background, leaving some areas less rendered where I want the glow effects to go. And I'm using the rubbing alcohol to really help soften those lines, help soften that streakiness, and help blend it. I'm also using alcohol ink in tiny little spray bottles. I actually find that the tiny ones work better because it's not just sitting around and going to waste, although it gets all over my hands, and it does get all over your desk. I have a Teflon coating on my desk, so it's easy to clean with just some rubbing alcohol afterwards. I'm going to use a little bit of just plain printer paper as a further mask because I'm using the alcohol inks in spray bottles to kind of build up that background color, build up that depth, and to kind of hide some of the streakiness. So I was using BV23 and now I'm using Ranger Eggplant, and you can see I'm just spritzing it all over the place. So what this does is it kind of creates a diffuse blend of this color. Now, if you have the Copic ABS system, you can use it for the same thing. I like the spray bottles because as long as I have alcohol ink, it works with any alcohol ink I have. So I can use Pinata inks and I can use Ranger inks as well. But the Copic ABS or any sort of airbrush system, I know there's a few different ones on the market, will work with a variety of markers. So it's really about what you're comfortable with, what you can afford, and how much space you have in your studio. Now I'm going to use Green Bice, which is YG01, I believe, and I'm spritzing that as the beginning of my glow effects. This is the base color for my glow. So as you can see, it left quite a mess on my tabletop. You can use rubbing alcohol and paper towels, rubbing alcohol and microfiber or a towel, or you can even use alcohol toilet moist towelettes to remove it. So once my alcohol ink has had a chance to dry, it's time to remove the washi tape. At that point, I had some tearing and I ended up re-inking her face a little bit. It did damage the paper a little bit, but fortunately her face was so lightly rendered, it really isn't noticeable. So you guys can see there's some areas where I overmasked. And it's better usually to overmask than it is to undermask. So I'm using that Green Bice color, YG01, to start to fill in the gaps around the glow. I'm also using that same color to kind of push the color back to the back of the paper and create more of a glow effect. So the colors I use to create my undertone are BV000, BV20, and Ranger Eggplant. Wow, Ranger Eggplant in a Copic sketch marker. I'm sorry, in a Copic Wide marker, as well as BV23 and Eggplant in spritzer bottles with YG01 to start creating the spray effects. So now I'm applying a layer of undertone or pre-tone, like a grisaille effect with watercolor, and this is going to help create and establish some of the shadows, and it's also going to help prevent the shadows from becoming too harsh or bleaching out the colors if I were to apply them on top. So I'm starting with BV000, and I'm using a Copic sketch to apply it, and I'm really just focusing on creating areas of light and shadow. So I'm not thinking too much about color, I'm thinking a lot about the glow and creating those areas of glow. So with alcohol markers, you can create multiple variations of the same tone by layering the same color over and over. So once I finished with BV000, I moved on to BV20, which is a darker blue violet. And what we're looking for is a purplish color that's very desaturated and very soft, and that's gonna help imply shadow. And blue violet is kind of a good all-rounder. It's not so desaturated that it desaturates all the color that interacts with it. You could use a cool gray, but it might desaturate a little bit too much. And it's not so saturated in this instance that it becomes distracting. I'm also using Ranger Eggplant in a Copic sketch on the cauldron, as well as to start blocking in some of the cast shadows. And I'm blending out that cast shadow in the hat using YG01. So I really like this technique, particularly in areas where there's intense or harsh shading, because it allows you to pre-color what you're doing, and it kind of allows you to establish your shadows earlier on, so you can use that as a roadmap as you work, rather than trying to figure out where you wanted your shadows later. So here is the second important part that got eaten by the sands of time, and it is the glow effects. So I'm gonna doodle a couple of mushrooms, and we're gonna talk about how to render glow effects, and hopefully you can extrapolate that to the illustration. So I am starting with I'm gonna end up starting with a spritzer bottle. There we go, with our YG01, very similar to what we just did on the main illustration. And this spritzer of color creates a soft, diffused glow. If you get all on top of it, you're gonna get like a smaller spray pattern that's more intense. If you pull back really far, you're gonna get a much softer, diffused pattern. And you can mask this with washi tape or even just regular paper. Then I'm going in with PB180. It's a Prismacolor, it's like a fluorescent color. And this is the base color that I used for the glows in this illustration. And I'm just coloring the whole thing. So the thing about glows is you want the exterior to always be lighter than the interior, unless there's like something blocking it or there's a reason there's a cast shadow. So then I'm going in with YG01, that's our Bice green color. And I'm coloring in the center, and then I'm gonna blend that back out with PB180. And generally with glows, you want really, really soft transitions. Next, I'm going in with, it's like, I'm gonna have to look it up. It's a blue-green now. It's BG13, so it's a very light blue-green. And then I'm blending that back out again with our YG01. Then I'm going in with Prismacolor Apple Green. So this is kind of a bright light green. I don't do this with every part of the illustration, just some of the parts. And it's just kind of a nice additional step. And the color for that is PB167. I had to go look that up. And blending that back out with our Prismacolor Fluorescent, and then blending that back out with our Copic Green Bice. And when I do my alcohol marker reviews, I always talk about marker compatibility. And you guys can see why. I use multiple different brands on any given piece. I spritzed it with some rubbing alcohol just to kind of diffuse it a little bit. And then I'm going back in with our BG13 and tightening up the shadows. And I'm not going to blend it as much. And then finally, I'm going in with a much darker blue-green from Copic. That would be BG09, just to add in some details and some shadow. So you guys get the gist of the glow effects. I basically applied this in varying degrees to this illustration. As for the purple on her dress and her skirt, so I started with her hat. I started with PB171 and I blended it out with BV20 and YG00. That's our very light yellow-green color to create a glow effect. Then I went in just in spot areas with PB127 and then PB73, a Shinhan purple color, and then finally PB51, my darkest colors. On the skirt, I started with PB171, then blended in some PB127, then some PB73 from Shinhan, and then finally PB51, leaving the glow of the mushrooms. For her shirt, it's kind of a cream color, but we're in a dark room. So I started with Blick 093, and then I added in shadows of PB199. For her much darker purple colored vest, I started with PB127, then I layered on PB73, a Shinhan color, and then I went in with PB51, and then I shaded with, I think, C8 to get that blackish color. For her shoes, I started with E09, then I went in with E47, and then finally E59. So that brings us to the cat. For the cat, I started with Blick Studio 009, so it's like a honey yellow color. Then I layered on YR14, so we're getting more orange, and then YR09, so a darker orange color on top of that. For the cat's wings, I'm using the same colors that I used for the mushrooms and for the cauldron. So we start with PB180, then we go in with YG01, then a little bit of PB167, which is that green color, and then some BG13 for shadow. For the gargoyle part of the wings, I'm using cool grays. So I'm using Copic C3, Copic C7, and Copic C8. So for her skin, I am using, and I'm keeping it really, really light. I want it to be really light and kind of delicate, and I want to really focus on how glowy her eyes are and her skin is. So I start with a base of PB24, and that's what I'm using right now. And I apologize so much for losing so much of the footage. My camera ate it, and I'm just as disappointed as you guys are. Then I went in with 025, which is a sketch marker, and then I went in with Copic E00. Then for the blush, I start with Copic 079, which is a really light pink, and I use that on the interior of the cat's ears as well. Then I move on to E93, which is a Copic color, so we're building up that color, and then I'm gonna finally use a little bit of R02. So for this, I'm mostly keeping the shadows very light and very delicate. You can still see that undershading color that I applied originally, and that's influencing our skin tone. If we'd done it the other way around, if we did our skin and then we applied those light blue violets, it would have desaturated the skin way too much, and it would have made her look a bit like a zombie. So she has red hair, and in this illustration, it's really important that we don't desaturate the hair too much, but the hair looks like it actually belongs to the environment. And I'm using a bunch of different colors for her hair. We started with a base of 009, similar to the base we started with the cat. Then we went on to Copic YR23, which is more orange and a little bit more saturated. So we're building up that color. Then we're going to use YR24. So when I say we're using more orangey tones, I'm not talking like wha-bam, it's orange. When you're rendering red hair, it's really important to think more in terms of yellows and coppers and browns than like and some people do have cooler red tones in their hair as well, but you want to avoid it going like Ronald McDonald red, because that is pretty unusual. So after we've applied our YR24, we use some 072 and some YR09, and we're starting to get into the really red tones. And then we add some PB86, so we're getting really red, but as we're layering it on here, it doesn't look like brick red. It looks very natural. So at this stage, I applied some shadow color underneath her chin, and for that, I used the V95 from Copic. And then I used V05, which is a much more saturated red violet that actually works really well in this instance, because when you think about how saturated her hair is, how warm her hair is around her, it's going to cast some of that color. So for the shadows, I'm filling it in now with C10, which is a really dark, cool gray. And I'm going to use that to fill in the shadows on the stones as well. For the stones, I started with W4, and that really desaturated things a lot, which didn't work so well in our darker areas, but worked really well in the glow from the cauldron. And then I went over that with W7. I did another layer of W7 on top of that to kind of build in those little dips in the stones. And then I'm going to use W8 to further shade it. I used Prismacolor's Indigo to start adding some blue on the frog, and I realized we didn't really get to talk about the frog too much. So the colors that I used on the frog are 095, PB167, PB186, and BG09 with a final shading of Prismacolor Indigo. And I tried to work back and forth to kind of soften those blends and soften those transitions. So now I want to start working more on the background, kind of blending it in, because it stands out too much and the glow effects aren't quite as strong as I would like. So I'm using that Copic sketch filled with eggplant, and I'm creating a radial pattern. As you saw, I went all the way around using the brush. So this won't really work super well with bullet tip markers. You might be able to get it with chisel tips. And applying pressure at the beginning and then lightening the stroke at the end. And I went around with our YG01, our green bice. It's like an acid green color. And I did the reverse. So I did streaks of that heavy towards the start of the glow and then feathering back out into the background to kind of augment that glow effect. Now I'm going in with C10, doing the same kind of radial pattern, but I'm not covering as much ground as I did the first time. So the whole thing about building up color and building up contrast and depth is you want to cover less each pass. So now that I've developed the background a little bit more, I'm going back in and adjusting the shadows. And I'm actually using C10 for this. And I end up adding black as well because I just couldn't get it dark enough. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to render the stones just enough that they make sense in the background. So I drew in some additional stones and I added a lot more shadow to create this sense of contrast as well as to further that sense of glow. Now I'm using, I started with Blick Studio brushes, I think it's Antique Black, and it wasn't quite what I was looking for. So now I'm using a Copic sketch filled with Ranger's Pitch Black to create another layer of shadow. Now the thing is, when you're thinking about black, there's really no such thing as just endless black unless you're talking like Vanta Black where it reflects no light. Black objects reflect light, and even shadows can have a depth to them. So I'm building up the depth of my shadow. Now I'm using just regular 100, which would be just regular Copic black, which is something I really rarely use. I really rarely get so dark in an illustration that only the black marker will suffice. But in this instance, we need to pull out the black marker. In fact, we even need to get darker than that. So for the interior of her mouth, I wanted something really dark red and saturated to match it, so I used Copic's RV69 for that. And at this point, I'm just kind of finessing things. I'm going back into her hair and kind of adjusting it because it was more orange than I really wanted it. I wanted it to be a little bit more red. So I'm just feathering in some more red, and I'm kind of adjusting the cat's fur as well, adding in some more shadow because the cat is just a little bit too light given the environment. I didn't want to overwork her too much. I still wanted her to be recognizable as like a light ginger cat. I also wanted to fix the glow a little bit, so I'm going back in with that really light Prismacolor yellow-green, which would be PB 180. And I'm just going over my existing marker and applying it, and that's going to push that color back. So now we're masking again. I cut some shapes out using just plain old copy paper, and I'm spritzing in some YG01, and this is really going to help enhance the glow effects that we had going. And recutting and repositioning and spraying again and again. So much of most kinds of art is doing a thing and evaluating it and adjusting the thing, and doing a thing and reevaluating it and adjusting a thing. And this is true whether you're doing alcohol markers or if you're doing watercolor. And honestly, this is one of the funnest parts of art for me, is when things are going well, but I'm still finessing it into a finished piece that I really like. So her dress wasn't really dark enough for me, so I went in with C10 and I added some shadows, and then I blended that back out with our PB51, our really dark purple. So we're mostly done with our markers here, but we're not done yet. There's still a few things I want to do. I'm going to use some color pencils. I'm going to use some white gouache. I'm going to do a little bit of re-inking, and I'm going to add in some more shadows to this piece just to further enhance what we've got going on, because it looks great, but it could definitely look a little bit better. So one of the first things I'm doing is I'm just re-inking a little bit, and this allows me to adjust the contrast. So I'm using a blue fudenosuke to add some additional bubbles and shadows to the cauldron, just to kind of tighten things up a little bit. I'm also going to re-ink around the mushrooms and the frog just a little bit, adding a little bit more contrast, but trying not to darken or deaden it too much. Now, could you guys imagine if I'd inked this thing with just black ink? We have so much liveliness coming from the colored line art. But speaking of black ink, there are some areas that are just not strong enough contrast. So I'm going back over them with the Sakura Pigma FB, just here and there, to add some additional shadow. This is particularly useful in her hair, where I really hadn't gotten quite the contrast that I'd wanted, or the delineation between the hair and the skin. I'm also using it on the purple lacing on her vest, as well as on the kitty's wings. So the gargoyle wings on the cat are actually inspired by a harness Bowie has. Everyone seems to love it, and he looks so adorable on it. So I wanted to draw a magical kitty who sprouted wings thanks to a magical glowing potion. I'm adding a little bit of brown to the cat's fur. This is going to add a little bit more shadow and a little bit more delineation. And now I'm going in with some Polychromos color pencils. So ideally, if you want to do color pencil on top of your alcohol marker art, you're going to want to apply a spray fixative, because that's going to give the paper a new tooth. Strathmore Smooth Bristol is, in my opinion, too smooth to be fun to use with color pencils. Your mileage might vary, but I like toothier papers. What I was trying to achieve with this, though, wasn't a lot of color pencil. I'm just adding color pencils here and there. Like on the stones, I'm using a white Polychromos just to add some highlights. Now, of course, you can use alcohol marker as kind of your base. Spray that spray fixative and then go whole hog on top of it with color pencils, and there's some beautiful art like this. So the black shadows in many areas of this picture were not dark enough, even using Copic black. So I'm using a Sakura Pigma BB, that's their big brush pen, to get a much darker black on this illustration. I'm also applying some radial lines just to kind of further that depth to the illustration. I really want it to look like this room is lit by the mushrooms and by the pot and by the wings of the cat. So now I'm going in and adding some gouache highlights here and there. This is not as fine a brush as I would normally do, so I do have some control issues with it, but I am trying to use a really delicate hand and mostly using the white gouache for rim highlights. So I wanted to improve the storytelling from this, especially since Joseph thought she was trying to reach the cat to throw it into the pot. I was horrified because that's Remy. So I wanted it to appear like the cat grew its wings from the potion. So I'm creating a spiral effect using the Polychromos color pencils, and I'm also adding some little magical shoujo sparkles to imply magic is at play here. And I'm going to use the white gouache to kind of further that. So we used yellow polychromos, white polychromos, and phthalo blue polychromos to start our magical spiral. Now we're using the white gouache to kind of add some more highlights and to complete it. We're also going to use the white gouache to add some more sparkles in the background, as well as highlights on the girl's eyes and on the cat's eyes. I'm also going to use the white gouache to add more bubbles to the pot to really make it look more like a bubbling cauldron. And finally, one more mask. We're gonna flick some white gouache onto the background. This is going to continue that kind of glow, like particles in the air are reflecting the light. It's also going to kind of continue that magic and just add a little bit more contrast and depth to the illustration, as well as some texture, because alcohol markers can sometimes seem kind of flat and lifeless on the paper. So I like to find different ways to add texture. Now we get to finally remove our border of washi tape, and this gives us a nice clean edge, but the spray effects kind of damage the rest of the paper. But boy, you can really see how much marker work we did on this. So what I want to do is I want to trim those edges off. So I'm just going to use a paper trimmer. This is not my favorite paper trimmer. This is my secondary paper trimmer, and it's not quite big enough for this. We can trim two of the edges though. So I'm also going to use a piece of chipboard and a ruler and the same Cricut X-Acto blade, and we're just going to slice off those longer edges. So this is going to give us a nice clean border around our illustration. All right, we are basically done. It took a couple of days to do this. There were so many times when I thought I had like irreparably goofed this or ruined it, like when I tore her face. And I am really legitimately sorry about the footage that was lost. It was some of my favorite footage, and it's such a bummer that I just don't have it to share it with you guys. So part of this story is missing. But I am grateful that I was able to make such a cute illustration. A little bit of perseverance really paid off, and I got to do some really fun techniques with this, and I hope my little makeup tutorials in here made up for what we were missing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this illustration. I hope you guys enjoyed hanging out with me, and I hope you guys found this tutorial to be helpful, useful, and informative. If you are staying at home this Halloween, I hope you have a safe and happy and healthy Halloween full of wonderful things, whether that's candy or family or goofing around on the internet. I hope your Halloween is full of those things, and if you are going out this Halloween, I hope you will remember to wear a mask, to be safe, and to practice social distancing. I, like everybody else, want to go out and play sooner rather than later, and we can do that by being safe and trying to be as healthy and socially conscious as possible. So I had a blast making this illustration for you guys. I really enjoyed getting to play around with my markers and with my spray inks. So I hope you guys have a happy Halloween, and I hope to see you guys again really soon. Have a happy Halloween, y'all. Bye!